Okay, wow. Thank you for being here. My name is Sarah Hodges-Kolesnik. I'm the director here at the gallery. And I want to start the evening by acknowledging that MHC Gallery is located on Treaty 1 territory, the ancestral lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, and Dakota people and the homeland of the Red River Métis. We gratefully acknowledge their stewardship of these lands and waters and are committed to creating shared spaces of understanding and reconciliation. If this is your first time here, welcome, and if not, welcome back. I know there's a few faces I recognize. So some of you will know then that MHC Gallery strives to be a space where people are invited to know, respect, and understand one another through artistic expression. We welcome artists of all backgrounds and skill levels to exchange ideas of faith, spirituality, creativity, and culture, and we believe that through the exchange of ideas, we grow together. So thank you for joining us for our special talk tonight that we're calling Ice Moments, Past, Present, and Future. The exhibition that most of you have had a chance to take in celebrates the legacy of Klaus Hochheim, a climatologist and ice researcher who also happened to be an amazing photographer. So his wife, Martha Hochheim, shared the work with me about a year ago to mark the 10th anniversary of Klaus's tragic passing in a helicopter crash in the Arctic in 2013. And so we worked together curating the collection and getting it ready to exhibit here today to share with you. And throughout the run of the exhibition, because it closes in just over a week, we've had a lot of really interesting discussions about what may have changed in the Arctic and the Antarctic since the 10, 15 years ago that Klaus was making these images. Is climate change having more of an impact? How does the landscape look different? How has research changed or not? And how does this all connect to Klaus's legacy? So I really wanted to think about some of those questions and discussions tonight, and we're really fortunate to have an artist and a scientist who have been working as recently as this summer in the Arctic. So I'll introduce them in just a moment. And I forgot to point out Martha. Martha is here tonight, of course, so thank you, Martha. If you don't know her and you want to talk about Klaus or the work, we'll have time after to do that and to ask questions. But first, I want to introduce Sue Sorensen, our partner in bringing the work to press. So the exhibition is also an exhibition catalog, a fine art book that's for sale tonight, and Sue's going to talk a little bit more about that. So thank you, Sue.
Well, good evening, everyone. I am Sue Sorensen. I'm a professor of English here at Canadian Mennonite University, and I help out at the gallery. And on behalf of the faculty, staff, and students of Canadian Mennonite University, welcome. I'm also the director of our very, very small publishing company, CMU Press, and together with MHC Gallery, we took the unusual step of creating a high-quality exhibition catalog of this exhibition. I've never done anything quite like this before. Doubles as a beautiful coffee table art book. Excellent gift, if I may say. For this display of the late Klaus Hochheim's Arctic and Antarctic photographs. And I won't take up too much of your time, but I will say we have lots of books for sale, and if anybody wants to buy like 10, maybe talk to me, I'll give you a discount. So we have lots of books for sale, and if you don't want to get one here at the gallery, or if you don't have time, it's also for sale in our university bookstore, which is called Common Word. So please consider that, which will support the proceeds. Once we pay the printing bill, will benefit the gallery and CMU Press. And I won't take up too much time, but I do want to state my gratitude for the leadership of Sarah Hodges-Kolesnik, who's the director of this gallery. And believe it or not, she's been working half-time. There's been no full-time curator here. She's been half-time, and we've just found out this week that she will now be full-time. Yay! So She is the author of a very fine essay about the photography, about Klaus's photography. Sarah herself is a very fine photographer, and that's her area of expertise. So if you want to know all about the photography, you can read the essay that she has written in this book, which I will show you in a moment. And I'm sad David Babb can't be here tonight. Dr. David Babb wrote the other essay in this book, which is the scientific essay explaining Klaus's scientific career and some of the aspects of ice research, which Klaus did, and which David is doing this very moment. I've been following him on Instagram this week, and I thought, he's not going to make it here, is he? Because he seems to be up north still. And a lot of his photographs on Instagram remind me of Klaus's photographs. So I'm very grateful to David for his very fine essay on the science behind Klaus's ice research. And I think I'll just read a sentence of David's essay, which really brought things to life for me. So this is the book, a hardcover book called Ice Moments. Most of it is full page, full color photographs, and you can have a look at it later. It's just around the corner over there. But I'll read you just a bit of David's essay. While our phones make remote sensing photography seem easy and accessible to all, for scientists, the world of remote sensing is much more complex, requiring both a keen eye and a thorough understanding of physics. Dr. Klaus Hochheim had these talents and used his love and knowledge of remote sensing both to create the beautiful photographs in this book and to further our collective understanding of the world around us. You get a real sense of Klaus both in this exhibition and in the book. And my last thanks, of course, is to Martha for sharing Klaus's photographs with us and for sharing him with us a bit. I'd never met Klaus, but I wish I could have known him. And I am very excited that we have preserved and honored his photography and his scientific work in this book, which I encourage you to acquire. And thank you for your support of CMU Press and of MHC Gallery.
Thank you, Sue. So I would like to introduce our first guest. Jonathan S. Greene is an artist working in print media and drawing, born in Labrador City, Newfoundland and Labrador. Greene comes from Mi'kmaq, Inuit, and settler heritage. Greene earned an MFA in printmaking from the University of Alberta, and in 2016, he canoed down the Yukon River from Whitehorse to Dawson as part of the Canadian Wilderness Artist Residency. He has also hiked extensively through the Rockies and in Alaska and has been awarded grants from the Canada Council for the Arts, Manitoba Arts Council, and the Winnipeg Arts Council. He was a recent participant in the Arctic Circle Artist Residency, and I'm sure he'll speak a little bit more about that. So, Jonathan, thank you for being here.
I thought about coming as in the tradition of many explorers doing presentations on their work in full explorer gear with parka and big, winter pants. But of course, it being as hot as it is today, I decided not to. And of course, we're all from Winnipeg. We all know what a parka looks like, but so it would have been lost upon you. My name is Jonathan S. Greene. I did the Arctic Circle residency from April 26th to May 17th of this year. The Arctic Circle residency was started, I think, in 2004 by Aaron O'Connor, and he just was trying to find a way to get artists up to Svalbard with idea of like speaking on climate change or exposing artists to this wonderful environment. They've done artist residencies, I think, twice every year since. So there's been many artists that have done this trip and experienced the landscape of Svalbard. Sarah Geisen is the leader, expedition leader, and she's been guiding it for 13 years. So we had a lot of experience. I felt secure. I felt safe about going. Like previous friends had done the residency, and they came back in mostly one piece, so it was good. As you can see from the map, Winnipeg all the way down there as home, Newfoundland being where my heart sometimes is, and Svalbard all the way up there. So I left on a Thursday morning at 6 a.m. I got to Svalbard at 7 p.m. Friday and went to bed at 9 p.m. and slept. Growing up in Newfoundland, I experienced icebergs coming down from Greenland, down past Labrador, and they're always a sight to behold growing up. And they've always kind of like fascinated me. I sometimes wondered what the big draw was for tourists, but they always kind of stuck in my head. And so some of my early work was dealing with the Arctic landscape, this kind of landscape and imagery from expedition books, explorers, logs I was reading. That was my only kind of way in besides the iceberg. So we looked at, I was looking at Franklin, of course, Robert E. Peary, Frederick Cook, Amundsen, Nansen, all those guys. I'd like to say guys and women, but sorry, patriarchy. This is a lithograph of the Nansen expedition. Nansen purposely froze, got his boat stuck in the ice, and let the ice drift around the North Pole just to explore the sea ice and polar currents, just to figure out like how they move. Robert E. Peary kind of stuck out the most just because of, I guess, his ambition. Like I tried to get to the North Pole 3 times, 4 times, many expeditions, losing 8 toes out of 10. It was just like this. I was just coming out of art school. I was reading these essays and journals by them, and kind of struggling as a young person trying to make a go as an artist. And I still have my toes, so I can keep going. This is etching I did, trying to capture Peary coming back to the ship after failing again. And then I go to Alberta. I started exploring mountains. Started making art about mountains, the landscape, the infrastructure going up around them. And I came across this image one day. This was a meteorite that Peary brought back on after another failed North Pole expedition. As a kind of like, I found this meteorite. I'll take it in for science, so I have a victory. Meanwhile, removing this meteorite that was a source of raw material for the local Inuit population. So it was a weird thing to me, but also seeing it propped up here in storage also kind of caught my curiosity. And so I started making my own kind of rocks that were propped up. So, why do artists do artist residencies? Sometimes artists just need to, some people didn't get away, they'll go on a production residency where they'll just be somewhat isolated or have access to a studio of stuff that they don't normally have access to, just to get work done. There's residencies in Winnipeg that artists do, and so sometimes I just need to get some stuff done, get away from people. And then there's more experiential residencies where you want to experience something that takes you out of your element. That might be just going to a different city like Copenhagen or Germany or somewhere, or Newfoundland. And then there's ones that are a little more out there, like the Svalbard Arctic Circle residency. This is a map of Svalbard. In the red dot, you can barely see is Longyearbyen. That's where we landed, flew into, and then we set sail in a traditional sailing ship, of course. Up beyond, up there to 80.5 North, which if you read a lot of explorer journals, was kind of a significant. They were always trying to edge each other out, like, oh, I'm 80, oh, I'm 80.2, oh, I'm 84. So I felt pretty good I got to 80.5. Svalbard is also the location of the global seed vault that has stores a lot of seeds from all over the world in case of some dire emergency that would happen. They built it into the permafrost, thinking that it would keep the seeds cool, just because of the permafrost being cold. Unfortunately, they did not foresee a couple of years later the permafrost defrosting and started to heat up, so then they had to build another building to the side to house the utilities to cool it. And this is Longyearbyen, 2,000 people, quaint towns. Svalbard is interesting because it is administered by the Norwegian government, but it is not considered part of Norway. It is an international territory that any signatory to a treaty after World War II can have set up a base or research station upon it. And so any citizen of the world can go there. There's no customs, there's no immigration. You just have to prove that you can make an income. So you get a lot of transient people that are not there very often or go very quickly. So it's an interesting little microcosm. Do you have a Circle K? Of course. Signs along the perimeter of the town, basically saying don't go beyond here without a rifle because polar bears are in the area. This is the ship Antigua at port. And this is us, the crew, the residency, 27 artists from all over the world, people from Singapore, Taiwan, China, to people across Europe, America, Canada. I was a lone Canadian. And then a crew of 6 and 4 guides. We ate well. We also had a bar just in case. This is the galley. All of us. There's also a handy deck house that they built during COVID that was out on the deck so we could kind of look out the windows and have another free space to be in. We got the sails up numerous occasions, and that was always the kind of preferred way of traveling on the ship. Turn the motor off, get the sails going. The ship listed less, meaning it didn't rock very much when the sails were up. It was more balanced, which for some people really helped their stomachs. And so on this residency, I had applied wanting to kind of connect to this earlier work that I'd done when in my younger years. That was kind of like an Arctic imaginary. I saw icebergs, I had images from explorer journals, but a lot of the imagery I kind of was making up. And now I wanted to revisit it and see it for myself, experience for myself. I had known about the Arctic Circle residency probably from when it first came out, like 10, 15 years ago, as I said, and I always wanted to do it. Could never tried, wondering about funding, getting the grants, so forth. So I was always unsure about it. And last year I finally applied. I say, why not? And I got in. And so I was finally after seeing so many of my friends and colleagues do it, I'm okay, I'm getting to do it. But going up there, I had this idea of talking about the landscape and climate change, but not quite sure what else. Having talked to previous artists who had done it, like they said, well, the best thing is to go up and just experience it. Don't try to come up with some nuanced project, because when you get up there, all that will change. It was nice being an artist on the ship because, like, as you can tell from the gallery, we were well fed. We had 3 meals a day plus cake every day. Cake every day. 4 o'clock cake and then after supper cake. It was like I was kind of like I'm gonna have to cut back on the second helpings here because they'll be rolling me off this ship. And so on days that we weren't traveling, because there was a few traveling days to get around areas, the second day specifically we had to go up around the west coast, exposed to ocean waves. The boat was pretty tippy. A lot of people spent time in their bunks. But on a regular day, we would either do an expedition, a landing in the morning where we would go ashore and either do a hike, or they would set up a perimeter. Or we'd be, hand on rail, looking at the horizon and just taking it in, which was also wonderful to have that time to think. So me in the orange, obviously the guy from Winnipeg, my friend Tavi, who was from Estonia. We were cabin mates. We had to share cabins. We did see animals. Not a lot, but we saw a couple polar bears, a few walrus, seals. I did not get the shot because it turns out the secret to wildlife photography is having a lens as big as your arm, which is fine. I had an okay lens, but this is from one of the guides, Tomas. He captured this. And obviously we didn't go ashore in that area that morning. This is the ship. So, there was obviously a romanticism to this expedition that kind of drew me in as well. Like, I'm going on a tall sailing ship around the Arctic. Like, I was kind of connecting with all those like stories I read about the explorers. Sometimes we would just dock up against some ice and moor against the ice and just come down the gangplank and we would go exploring. Our guides would set up a perimeter, polar bear watch. And we could do whatever we wanted in that perimeter. So some people did sound recordings. They would take an auger out, or as they say in Norway, ice bore, and just do sound recordings of whatever the sounds or ice we were making, or if you could hear some animals. We had room to roam. We could draw, sit down. Other mornings, we would go out in the Zodiac. There was 2 Zodiacs on board. And sometimes just, drive around, recording the ice, taking in the glaciers closer up, or we'd go ashore with the Zodiac. Here's myself. I don't know why I'm looking so peeved off, but yeah. I believe this was the view. So, I would just sit down in my parka and just start drawing the landscape, taking it in. Not so much to exhibit those watercolor paintings, but just to kind of record it in a way that was different than my camera. Somehow I felt like that got it in my head a little more. Other times I was recording on the ship. It was easy when ice was just coming by you. And there was like a wide variety of projects. Some people had drones that they were sending up in the air. Some people had drones that they were sending in the water. There were some citizen scientists doing projects there. There was poets. There was a variety of journalists. There was one woman who is a war correspondent in Istanbul, covering stuff in Yemen and other Middle Eastern areas of conflict, who's just trying to transition into that field, which you totally got. And so like, it was a nice reprieve for her to focus on trying to capture wildlife or the landscape. And then my roommate, my cabin mate, as I mentioned before, Tavi, he brought a bunch of Greene man suits. And so we got dropped off on this little island. And we donned our Greene man suits, and he was out in the Zodiac, and he captured some photos against this imposing glacier. It was interesting. It was like an interesting project that he was doing. Then we had a woman, Anne, who was an aerialist, who was doing aerial work off, the bow of the ship. She's also an art historian in her spare time. I don't know how to introduce her. She's an art historian who also does aerial work, or an aerialist who does art historian work. But, they would come up in the Zodiac. She'd have this ring hanging down. She'd climb onto the ring, and the Zodiac would pull away, so there was only the water underneath. And she would do these performances that way. So, again, wide variety of artists exploring the residency. We often do hikes. During most of the days, we do a hike somewhere. Svalbard is known, like a reason why it was in international territory is because no one could really agree on who founded Svalbard. The British had a claim, the Norwegians had a claim, I think the Dutch had a claim, the Russians had a claim, and so they decided to let Norway kind of administer it, because they thought Norway, well, they're nice and neutral at the time, they'll administer it. But there is a Russian settlement on Svalbard called Barneberg. We as a group collectively had decided not to visit there just because of the current situation with Ukraine. But yes, they have their own settlement, their own buildings. And the main draw that early on in the century with Svalbard was coal mining or resource extraction. And there is still coal mining in Svalbard near Longyearbyen, and as well as the Russian settlement. And this was a abandoned coal miner's cabin. I don't have a picture, but you could see like seams of coal like at your feet, like it was just there. There's many other opportunities for mining that has happened in Svalbard over the years. Like someone tried to set up a marble quarry that went nowhere. Someone tried to set up a different kind of quarry. Like it's such a harsh place. And also like when they were taking the marble out, when the marble defrosted, when they moved out of Svalbard, it just kind of crumbled to rock or rubble. So like stuff like that comes up. And there's trappers' cabins around, and people from Longyearbyen have cabins around the island as well, because you need to get away from the busy life of Longyearbyen. So yeah, we do hikes. Sometimes I'll get a bit of elevation gain. Here's myself. This is up at 80.5 north. The lead guide, Sarah, she found us a puzzling group at first, because when we first docked on the ice the first day, she's like, oh, I couldn't tell if you enjoyed it or not, if you were excited. I was like suppressing giggles of glee, but I was trying to be cool. I was trying to be, cool. And so they had decided to go very far up north to see how, see if that's what we wanted. That would help, And it totally did. And so this is the ice pack as we went up 8.5, and we were allowed to climb up the ropes and take pictures. wearing safety harnesses and carbiners, of course. You can see the ship. And that day we also did polar plunges, of course, because why not? Why not get colder? To be honest, it was cold, but like most of the time it was like 0 or 3 degrees Celsius. So like, the guy from Taiwan, he was really having a hard time of it. But like, as a Winnipegger, I was like, oh, this is almost short sweater. Like, but of course, this was not. The dipping into the water was not pleasant. I will say that. I got up to my nose. I had trouble trying to swim, but then I was like, I'm not going to remember any strokes. It's so cold, and so I just kind of got up. Another artist, Rose McAdoo, she is a pastry chef that makes cakes and pastries and candies about climate change. And so on the expedition, she made this glacier cake trying to show the erosion and tidewater results of glaciers and how icebergs are made from glaciers. And so she had like these kind of lemon meringue, ocean water. There was like a really interesting rye and chocolate cake and icing and fondant. And so she's done a lot of projects where she'll also make some of these candies out in the field over a camp stove. And, making a cake in a tiny galley kitchen was quite a feat. And of course, I had to be the first one to cut into it, so. So I came up there, like I'm a printmaker, I'm a drawer. You could see by my earlier images in my work of etchings, prints of the landscape. And I kind of went up there with no plan. I had ideas in my head, but I took the advice I was given and I said, I'll just take it in. I am an avid runner, so I did bring my running shoes along here, Ben, just to run around the town. And then we got on the boat and we do a landing. I think it was the first landing I went to the guide and Sarah, and I was like, oh, could I run on the ice floe? Because that seemed intriguing. And she said, yes, of course. And so I started running around the perimeters. I had to stay within the perimeter, which in some areas it was awfully tempting to just like, oh, I just want to run to that. But, I was good. So these are tracks. And so I found out, like, this was kind of an impromptu idea that kind of came up spontaneously, but as I ran, I felt I focused in a different way to the landscape. In one way, I was looking at my feet, taking in the ice, looking for spots I had to avoid or not trip over, but also taking in the landscape in a different way than just standing and drawing would usually force me to be, I don't want to say passive, but in a different way. And this is, I had a GPS tracker on my watch, so this was recording my perimeter runs. Of course, at the time, this was all ice. That's about 1 kilometer away. Well, it's hard to say now because maybe that glacier receded a bit, but at the time, it was about 1 kilometer to the glacier itself of sea ice. So I started thinking, like, as I said, Crawford has been this destination for coal mining and resource extraction and geopolitics. But there's also a big segment of tourism and extreme skiing, extreme, kind of sports exploration. So I was kind of like, when I started running, I think I was experiencing the landscape in a different way that was a little more akin to them. And like, well, what does it mean to take in this landscape as a runner? What does it mean to take it in as a skier? Do we get to that sublime feeling differently? Does the sublime happen? Because we often talked about on the ship, like, we were taking photos of works, of stuff that we were seeing, and we're like, we'd often admit to ourselves, we can't do anything with this. It's too beautiful. How can we talk of any other issues when this place is just too beautiful to speak of. Like, how do you talk about such and such thing when geopolitics, when you got this beautiful glacier here? And so there's this kind of mixed ambivalence to it. But we also felt very safe and well taken care of as well. And so this is me running in front of the glacier. And so I felt like maybe I was just exposing myself just a little more by running around these glaciers or to these glaciers. But I'm not sure. This is kind of new work. It's only a couple months ago, so I'm still trying to feel it out. But that's some ideas of where I'm going. This is a huge fjord. I think this is called Hukla Fjord. And yeah, this is one of those spots that we were just like, it's amazing. There's so much beauty here. And yes, we know there's climate change. Yes, we know that the weather is warm. We know so many things, but yet we're struck by just being in this space. And so, so trying to balance on how to go forward. As I'm sure, like looking around the exhibition by Klaus, like, it's so beautiful. Yes, he has his science, but you can tell that he was just in love with the landscape as well. But of course, I gotta make something. So I've been working on some etchings at the moment of the previous glacier. Blacking at the moment because I'm not quite happy enough to try color, but trying to play around with it. Might start collaging other stuff into it, but this is where I'm hopefully going with this. There'll be prints, and somehow running will be involved there somehow. This is close-up detail. Another glacier we were on, ship closer to the glacier. And yeah, it was just, you are kind of taken in by the landscape. So I feel at this end of the presentation, I feel a little fuzzy and hazy because I'm not quite sure how to articulate where I'm going with the work. And this is our midnight sun, well, 2 a.m. sun. There's a big aurora borealis around this time, and when I got back to Wi-Fi, people were like, "Oh, did you see the northern lights?" I'm like, "No, there's no northern lights where I was too, except one. There was just one light." But yeah, we were often up till 2, 3, 4 in the morning sometimes, just because we had this fear of missing out on the landscape or seeing something. So yeah, it was an amazing trip. And yeah, I'll just end it there. Yeah. Do we have any questions, or will we do questions later, Sarah?
No, we can do questions now.
Okay, sure. Svalbard, Svalbard, also called Spitsbergen, depending on where you're coming from. Yeah. So you go to Norway, and you just keep going up further. Yeah. 2,000 people in Longyearbyen, and not sure how many in the Russian settlement. And there was a small town research station called Neil Olson that we went to, had different research stations from different countries, British, Chinese, Norwegian, American, but very self-contained town. Yeah. Tracy?
Was it snowing right there?
We did get a bit of snow one morning. A couple of times on the ship, we came out and it was kind of frosted over. I did start a snowball fight, I did think I would win being the Canadian against some of the others, but there was a few Northern American people like New York, Maine, so they knew how to throw a few snowballs too, but yeah. Yes. I felt it pretty good. Sometimes I wore like a liner glove, and that was okay to sketching. I will say my watercolor palette, as I mix up the colors, there were some mornings that my watercolors would start to freeze on the brush. And so I was like, okay, there goes painting today. And again, not to pick on the guy from Taiwan, Sean, he was a great guy, but he came to me one day, he's like, oh, John, I think I'm getting sick, my hands are getting stiff. And I'm like, no, you're not wearing your gloves. So a few of us had to help Sean out a bit, but yeah. He was just so happy taking photos, I wasn't noticing that. Yeah. Hi.
Just a little bit the ship. What's the significance of the sailage? Was it designed for those sort of
Yeah, it was a weird ship in that it used to be a long liner, and then they extended it and then put masts in it. So they converted this long liner fishing ship to a sailing ship, which I thought was like a weird Frankenstein build. So it wasn't a traditional wooden hull ship. It was a metal hull, Arctic rated ship. Though we did get stuck one morning that we had set anchor in front of this glacier. The glacier had calved, and it pushed the ship out. The pack ice pushed the ship out, and the chain ran out, and we were kind of caught in this pack ice. And nobody was panicking, except maybe slightly a little bit the captain, but we had to call on another ship with a more powerful motor and drive around us and break the ice up. So that was the closest I got to being stuck in the ice, which, to be honest, as a historical explorer reader, I was kind of hoping for it, but didn't want to really go home in a way. Like, as no Wi-Fi, no cell signal, it was kind of nice. But yeah, I think usually these ships are just used as another variety of bringing, I don't want to say tourists, because I'm trying to call myself not a tourist, but yeah, as a way of tourists. That particular ship was going back then to the Mediterranean to do tours down there, but it was another ship. So there are some bigger cruise ships that do tours, and then there's these really beautiful sailing ships that do tours as well. Yeah. But significant to me was just that's how all those explorers I read about went up there. So I was just like, I couldn't imagine going on something else. Yeah, yeah. There was, we did go out in one, like, we walked to one of the glaciers. This one that I was running in front of, we did a nighttime walk. Again, it was bright. And yeah, some people chipped off pieces of ice to taste. I think there was one artist who kissed some of the ice. But there was also one day, when we were celebrating the cake, we had this cake that Rose made. It's a longer story, but earlier that day, I had asked to do some donuts in the Zodiac with some other artists, because, juvenile guy making art, I don't know. I'm not sure where it's going, but I want to do donuts. So we done some donuts in the Zodiac, and then we went and found some glacier ice to bring back on the ship for cocktails. Well, again, this is making my story just seems like it was as a party bus, but this is only one party night really, but yeah, so like we were trying to get this piece of glacier chunk into the Zodiac, and it kept slipping out of the guy's hands. So I put on my mittens, my fabric mittens, and leaned in and let the fabric freeze to the glacier chunk, and then pulled it back in. Again, Winnipeg smart. Someone did have to grab my legs from going in, but I got that chunk aboard. But yeah, we tasted the ice. We tried to experience. People were, there's some people collecting dirt off the anchor, just some citizen science. Some people were collecting water, trying to look for tardigrades and other creatures in the ice in the water. So there's a huge amount of stimuli on this ship, and I think in one way the conversation with all these other artists was the best thing about the trip as well. Okay, thank you again.
Thank you, Jonathan. I was really struck when you were talking about that you have these artists from all different backgrounds, all different media that they work with, all kinds of different expressions, and you felt like you couldn't do anything with it. It was so beautiful. And I think there's something so interesting in about the reasons we make and the reasons why residencies like this are important and the reasons why artists' voice is important, because it's somehow, that human experience that we can't articulate that comes together in those moments. So thank you for sharing that with us. So I would like to introduce our next speaker. Now, Sue mentioned this already, that Dr. David Babb, who wrote the essay in our Ice Moments book, was going to join us tonight. Many of you probably saw the posters and the social media posts about that, but he is stuck in the Arctic doing research. And so we're really grateful that Dr. Alex Crawford, a colleague of David Babb's, is here to join us. Alex is an assistant professor of environment and geography in the Clayton H. Riddle Faculty of Earth, Environment and Resources at the University of Manitoba. He is also an expert in Arctic climate change, especially Arctic storm systems and Arctic sea ice. So I know he'll share all kinds of interesting things with us. I'm curious to learn more. Alex uses a variety of research tools, including remote sensing products, weather and climate models, and high-performance computing to track historical climate change and analyze future projections. So thank you, Alex.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thank you, Sarah. And you already provided the territorial acknowledgement, and I appreciate that, but that is applicable to the University of Manitoba as well, where I'm from. And the one other thing I want to say with respect to this is that what I'm going to present today is information that is coming from a Western science lens. That is what I am an expert in, but I also appreciate that today we also had a different perspective, an artist's perspective of the Arctic and sea ice and glacial ice up around Svalbard. And so the outline for what I have for us today is we talked about sea ice in the past, present, and future. I'm going to flip that order just a little bit. We're going to start with sea ice in the present. Then I'm going to walk through some historical changes that I've seen and that Klaus was seeing when he was working on this sort of topic. And then we'll end with some projections of the future. I'm going to be looking really wide scale. The photographs that you see around the gallery right here are up close and personal with the sea ice. I work with satellites. I work with climate models. So I'm going to show you a lot of maps that are showing you the whole Arctic all at once. We're also going to look at Hudson Bay as a whole a few times, and I do promise there will be at least one picture of a polar bear. All right, so first, sea ice in the present. The audience here is likely aware of what sea ice is, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, I'm going to provide an official definition, and that is 5 words. Sea ice is frozen seawater. So when I'm talking about sea ice, I am not talking about icebergs. We are not sinking the Titanic. We are talking about ice that is frozen directly from the ocean. It tends to form up at the surface of the ocean first. In the fall, in the winter, the ocean surface is warmer than the atmosphere above it. It gets really cold. Eventually, you cool that ocean down to its freezing point, which is usually a little below 0 degrees Celsius because it's salt water, so it's a little colder than that. And then once you get that first layer, it will slowly grow from the base over the course of the winter. Or, if you want to make it thicker a little bit faster, you get the wind to blow the ice around, and you take one ice floe and you blow it up on top of the other one, and that's what was happening here up against the shore. This is out near Churchill, Manitoba right here. And if we look at sea ice as of Monday, this is what Arctic sea ice looked like. That map on your left is showing you the white color is where there is 100% sea ice cover, and if it's completely white there, I also can tell you that there probably aren't a lot of like melt ponds on top of it, so it's a nice frozen white color there. And then anywhere that you're seeing the blues that are kind of a light blue, those are showing you places where there is ice there, but there's either a lot of melt ponds on top of it, or there's a lot of mixtures of ice and ocean water in between. And that's what the Arctic looks like in the summer. It's okay. That is normal for there to be that little ice. Well, at least normal for the last 10 years. Then on the right here, we have a graph that is showing us just the seasonal progression of sea ice over the past few months. And that's that blue line that you're looking at. That's this year. And so it's going down. There was about, right now, we're sitting little below 6 million, closer to about 5 million square kilometers. 5 million square kilometers, that's about the size of India. So it's a lot of ice, but it's nowhere near what it was just a few months ago. And the gray lines that you're seeing up here, that's what we would call normal. So yes, there's less than there used to be. We'll get to that a little bit more in a moment. Just to emphasize how much sea ice changes throughout the year, one thing that I do think is useful to show you is what a typical maximum extent of sea ice in the winter looks like and what a typical minimum of sea ice in the summer looks like. When I say winter and summer, I really mean the end of winter, so usually mid-March. And when I'm talking about summer, I really mean the end of summer, so usually about mid-September. So mid-March, sea ice tends to look like that. The white is anywhere that has at least 15% sea ice concentration. That is the official definition of what we count as having sea ice. You need to have any little pixel in that image has to have at least 15% of it be ice and no more than 85% be open water. And so there's sea ice down in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, Hudson Bay. If you go over to the Pacific side, the Bering Sea also has sea ice. All the way down to Japan, you can get sea ice. And then if you switch over to summer, the sea ice has been restricted all the way back to really just that central part of the Arctic Ocean. And that is the difference from being larger than Canada to being somewhere around the size of India. That's kind of the switch that we're doing. It's in numbers, that's going from somewhere up around 14.5 million square kilometers to being somewhere around 4.5 million square kilometers. So it's a really, really big difference between winter and summer. What that means is that most of the sea ice in the Arctic is seasonal. It only exists during the winter, doesn't exist during the summer. And that includes a lot of places that I focus on, like Hudson Bay. And so the frame that I tend to like to look at is what I would call sea ice phenology. And that word phenology, we borrow from ecologists. If you like flowers, if you like bees, that sort of thing, you may have heard this term before. What that term is talking about is just the seasonal timing of events. So for sea ice, we're thinking about when does the sea ice first grow or advance into an area. And then in the spring and summer, we're thinking about when does sea ice retreat or melt away. And so one thing that we can do is set up a little timeline there on the bottom, March 1st of one year on the left, March 1st of the next year on the right, and you're going to have sea ice cover at the beginning of March, but then eventually at some point in the spring or summer, it's going to start melting and go away, so the water will open up, and it'll eventually become ice-free. And so I call that the retreat or the melt day, depending on what day and which term I really feel like using. But we'll use retreat mostly right now. Then at some point in the fall, the atmosphere is going to cool down again. The ocean's going to start cooling down, giving its energy back to the atmosphere. Eventually, the ocean water is going to freeze back up. So we call that our freeze-up day or your advanced day of sea ice. So taking Hudson Bay as an example, and I like Hudson Bay because there's some really good papers by Klaus that I use all the time that are talking about sea ice in Hudson Bay. The retreat day tends to happen in, well, usually it's sometime in June and July is when you're seeing most of that retreat happen. It's actually a fun little pattern. You see up here, it actually starts to retreat up in the northwest part of the bay, not the south. We tend to think of the south as being warm, north as being cold. But it actually starts to retreat up here first and along the eastern side. And the last place in Hudson Bay to lose its sea ice, typically in late July, is down here in that southern part. And then the advance of sea ice back in fall and winter tends to be a little bit easier, a little to understand. It's really just kind of north to south. You start forming your sea ice usually in early November, up in here. And then by mid-December, you've covered the entire bay. That's the typical picture that we tend to see with Hudson Bay. If you don't like graphs and maps like that and you prefer circles, we can do circles for you. So here's the circle version, all right? So right here, I can't do this for like every single pixel in the image, so we're just gonna take Western Hudson Bay, so that part right there. We're gonna take that whole part, average everything together, and say when is that area typically covered with sea ice or ice-free? And then we're going to do it for a 5-year period, and I've chosen that 5-year period very deliberately. You'll understand in a few slides. Just 2005 to 2009, just to kind of see what could happen. And in that 5-year period, the range of when the retreat happened was anywhere from the very end of June to kind of mid-July. So we're going to color that whole thing yellow to say that's the zone when the retreat might happen. And then over here on the other end, when did the sea ice advance again? That was anywhere from about December 1st to like December 18th is what it was for that period. And then the dark blue, that's when it's ice-free. So dark blue, nice open water. And then on the other side is the ice present period. So there's ice covered that Western Hudson Bay area. And why might we care particularly about Western Hudson Bay? What's so special about that? Well, it's the polar bears. Of course it is. I did promise. All right. So we care about this Western Hudson Bay region. That region that I showed you is the subpopulation domain for the Western Hudson Bay polar bear population. So that's why we might care about averaging in that area in particular. And polar bears are near and dear to my heart because I go to Churchill quite a bit and always look for them and hardly ever see them. I see a lot of rocks that look like polar bears, but I see very few polar bears. All right. Now, the interesting thing about polar bears is that, well, a interesting thing, is that you can use the sea ice to get a really good sense of their habitats. Polar bears use sea ice as a platform to hunt seals. In particular, it's ringed seals. That's their favorite dish. It's not cake, it's ringed seals. So they have 4 o'clock ringed seals, and they have, what was it? Was it 10 o'clock ringed seals, John? 8 o'clock, 8 o'clock, okay. Anyway, yeah, 4 o'clock and 8 o'clock. And for them, that means that when there's no sea ice present, they have no platform to hunt. They can't get to their ring seals. The buffet is closed. And the other thing that is very notable to point out is when I tell you, oh, this is the time when the sea ice retreats and it's gone, the polar bears are like, try me. I bet I can find an ice floe. And so when our satellites are saying, oh, sea ice is gone, there's practically none left, we're below 15%. The polar bears are clinging on to whatever ice floe they can find. And so on average, you'll see the polar bears come onshore 18 days after the satellites say, yeah, you're done. There's really no more sea ice left, guys. So for that reason, what I've done to this diagram is I've modified it. I've modified it from a sea ice circle to a polar bear circle. So now I've showed you what the sea ice said in gray. So right up there, that's the retreat, there's the advance, and now I've colored in yellow, when do the polar bears move onshore and then start fasting? And then in the winter or late fall, when do they move back offshore onto the sea ice to go do their hunting? And remember this circle, we're gonna come back to it again later because you know what's coming next. I'm talking about sea ice, you know what's coming next, right? Changes, right? Okay, ooh, I skipped the slide, there we go. Historical changes, that's our next thing. So first of all, we have a very good satellite record of sea ice in the Arctic. And you can thank the US for this, so it's not all bad. And I'm from the US, I'm allowed to make that joke. Anyway, all right. So, oh, but I promise my father's Canadian, so I'm allowed to be here. All right, so we've covered all of that. We are losing what we could call our perennial sea ice cover and our seasonal sea ice cover. Our perennial sea ice cover, that's the sea ice that's left over even in September at the end of summer when everything is warmed up. So that's areas that have sea ice long term. Okay. And that means we're just going to measure what our sea ice is on average in September, and we're going to call that perennial. And if you look at the graph up here, what direction is the line going? Down, right? It's going down. We can see that. So that is an indication to us that we are losing our perennial or long-term sea ice. Okay, but how much is it going down? I think it is worth looking at this graph a little bit closer. The y-axis there is telling us the sea ice extent in millions of square kilometers. And back in the 1980s, a typical year, we were sitting 7.5 million square kilometers at the end of the summer. Nowadays, more often we're sitting around 4 to 4.5 million. That's a 40% decline. That's a big deal. And this only goes back to 1979. If you go back a bit farther, it's a bigger decline. Although we think this is probably when most of that decline has happened. If you look at March is telling us your seasonal sea ice, the maximum extent. That's also going down, but not nearly as fast. We've gone from being around 16 million square kilometers in March back in the early 80s. Today, we're sitting more like 14.5. So it's still a decline, but it's not quite as dramatic as September. So that's why you often hear people talk about sea ice in September. That's when it's a little bit more provocative. We also could just take a look at what single day has the least amount of sea ice. And this is the most recent day. We're not in September yet this year, so I have to show you 2023 data. And that is what the sea ice extent looked like. So any grid cell that has at least 15% sea ice concentration. And where does that rank all time? It's not the lowest. No. It's sixth lowest. The lowest is still 2012. It was a wicked weird year. I'd love to talk about 2012, but you'll get bored if I start now, so we won't. But overall, if you look at these years, these are all years 2007 or later, and they're all sitting at 4.6 million square kilometers or less is the low point that we're sitting at now. So that's our sea ice now coming from the early 80s. But that's just one way of looking at the change. Another way of looking at the change that I really like to do, because I focus on a seasonal sea ice area, is ask, well, how long is it ice-free? And so on the left, there's a map that shows you what was normal, how often an area was ice-free in the summer. And you can see the middle of the Arctic Ocean, that nice big dark blue color, that's telling us it was just ice covered the whole year. And then the yellow color is telling you it was open water the whole year. There was never sea ice. And then in a place like Hudson Bay, you can see that's an area that was open for several months out of the year. In that case, about 4 months out of the year. And then on the right, we see the change over this record that we have the satellites for. And the blue color is showing you places where there's less of an ice-free period than there used to be. Can anyone find the blue? That was not a trick question. There actually is one spot with blue. One little spot. Okay, but most of this is red, right? The red is showing us that the ice-free period is getting longer. And I want to reflect a little bit here on how big the change is, because I think it's easy to get lost in how big the change really is. Let's take this lightest red color we have, that one right there, kind of that pinkish color. That is 1 to 2. So let's take the low end. Let's be conservative. 1. What does that mean? It means that the ice-free period is 1 day longer on average per year. That doesn't sound that much, right? 1 day, that doesn't really matter. But you know how long this record goes back to, right? 1979. So that means that over 30 years, with a trend like that, that's equating to an increase in the ice-free period of about a month. That's substantial when there's only 12 months out of the year. And so if we look at places like Baffin Bay or the Chukchi Sea over here by Alaska and Russia, those are places that have about a month more ice-free than they used to. And if you look at a few other places, you can see there's darker red. There actually are a few places over east of Svalbard that have 5 or 6 months longer ice-free right now than they did in the 80s. And that's crazy. That's a really big change. And it's not all climate change. There's also like internal natural variability in the climate system that's accentuating that right now. But still, the climate change is giving us at least a month. And that alone is a lot. And the last thing that I want to point out, because I only have so much time about changes with sea ice historically, is that it's not just that sea ice is becoming less present. It's also the sea ice that is still there is thinner and younger than it used to be. It's also more mobile than it used to be. Lots of things are changing about it. But just for a moment, why am I talking about age of sea ice? It turns out measuring how old the sea ice is actually easier to do than measuring how thick it is from a satellite. And so we know that the older the sea ice gets, generally the thicker it gets. So those two things are going to be pretty closely related to each other. But actually the thing that we have the better record of is how old is the sea ice. And so if you go back to the 1980s, sea ice in the Arctic Ocean that you encountered would very likely be 3, 4, 5 years old, even older. But nowadays, if you go into the middle of the Arctic Ocean, it's going to be really hard to find sea ice that's older than about 2 years. Most of it's only 1 year old. Most of it's just seasonal sea ice now. It forms once and then it's gone. So what all of this change means is that there are new challenges in the Arctic, but let's be a little optimistic for a second. There's also more opportunities in the Arctic. One thing that you might call an opportunity, but also a new risk, would be shipping. And the Arctic is becoming more accessible to ship traffic. One example of this is called the Northern Sea Route. That's the route if you were to just track right along the northern coast of Russia. And since 2007, there's been more activity in that area. And if you look at ship traffic over recent years, it has gone up quite a bit. And just so you know, 2022, that was lower because of the war in Ukraine. Otherwise, it would have been a bit higher then as well. But also, you might notice 2020, COVID didn't stop this. There's more shipping going on there even with that. Oh, also, they have sent cruise ships through there now, too. There was very, very famous in my world, a cruise ship called the Crystal Serenity went through the Northwest Passage for the first time in 2016. So that's the first time the cruise ship went through. So good for them. All right. So now that we talked about how much change that we've experienced in the historical record, I think it's also worth talking a little bit about what the future is going to be like. And the short answer is, well, the trends we see historically will continue so long as the world keeps warming up. We could end it right there. That's the simple answer. But I think that younger generations in particular often feel a lot of stress and angst about, well, how much is it going to change? How different will the world be by the time I'm old enough to make a difference politically? So let's try to put some numbers on it about how much change should we expect. It's a hard thing to do. And they're not perfect, but one of our best tools for doing this is climate models. So I'm going to give you the really short version of what a climate model is. Climate model is basically a giant block of little cubes with math. That's what it is. So anyone here, if you ever work with Excel, those have lots of little cells and you can put numbers in them. That's what a climate model is. It's three-dimensional, it's not two-dimensional, so it's more complicated. But it's just little cells, and then there's numbers in those cells. Those numbers for the atmosphere represent the temperature, the humidity, the cloud cover, any aerosols in the atmosphere that you can breathe in and cough. That stuff is all in there. Carbon dioxide concentrations in there. Everything you can think, well, not everything, it doesn't have birds usually, but most of the things that you can think of that might be relevant to weather are gonna be in there. The ocean has little cells. It has the temperature. It has the salinity of the ocean. It has the density. All of those things are in there. And then, well, then there's time. So you can have all of those values right now, and then you can have all of them an hour from now. And this is where the math comes in. So now we have all of these physics equations that you may have learned some of at one point in your life that govern things like motion. How do things move? How does the air move? How does the water move? But also energy. So if you think about one thing that's warm and another thing that's colder, and you've ever like, I don't know, tried to roast marshmallows and then did it with a metal stick and then your hand got warm, right? That sort of thing. All those little equations about energy moving around. We have to put all of those in there. And then you hit play and you let it run for many years. And it takes a long time. And then your friend down the street says, you made a mistake. I can do it better. Your math's not good enough. They make their own climate model, and then they run that. And then somebody from a little bit farther down the street does the same thing over and over again. There are dozens of climate models out there from all around the world. Canada has one that they really like. And the US has several because they have to, because it's the US. China has several because, of course, they have to. The EU has one, but then every EU country has to have its own independent of the EU, especially England, and of course now they're not even in the EU. Okay, so that is climate models. We take all of these climate models. We know none of them are perfectly right. None of them are right all the way. But as a whole, if you take them all together, and you kind of average it all together, you get a pretty good picture of what the climate can be like. They actually do a remarkably good job overall at reproducing historical climate that we can measure, and paleoclimate, things that we know from digging in the dirt and getting ice cores and things. We know information about what the climate used to be like. And these models are able to reproduce a heck of a lot of it. They're a lot better than people on TV would make you think, but they're not perfect. And so when you do that, there's one last element you need. And that is you need to ask the question, what are humans going to do? The climate models can't tell you that. They tell you the climate. They do not tell you whether Canadians will keep their carbon tax, right? They can't do that. So what they then do is run scenarios. They run scenarios that say, let's assume that humans emit this amount of greenhouse gases every year up until 2100 or 2300. So they are making assumptions about the economy, about populations, about decisions that governments make. And that's where we end up with these three colors, red, yellow, and blue. The red line is telling you high emissions. That's if we were to emit a lot more greenhouse gases over the next several decades. Yellow is medium emissions, blue is really low. Blue, you might see that line actually levels off at some point. That does, yes, mean that we would have to have net zero emissions for that one. The y-axis for this graph is telling you the temperature. Although it's not exactly the temperature, it's technically something called the temperature anomaly. That word just means how different is the temperature now from the late 1800s. And we always go back to the late 1800s, that's our kind of benchmark. And so when someone tells you we want to limit warming to below 2 degrees Celsius, they mean 2 degrees Celsius relative to the average from 1850 to 1900. That's actually what that means. Just for context, right now we're at about 1.3. That's where we sit this year right now, ish. And that's ish. We never know it exactly. Okay, so if we know this, and we know that when we get a certain amount of warming is going to be highly dependent on the emissions that humans have, it's really hard to tell you what year anything will happen. It's a lot easier to tell you what temperature something will happen at. So in my work, what I typically do is I say, I don't want to worry about humans because they're too hard to predict. So let's just look at how much warming do we need for certain things to happen. And if we're looking at Arctic sea ice, there is something that is fairly convenient. It really doesn't matter how fast the emissions happen or what kinds of emissions. Really, if you just take the overall warming that the Earth experiences, you will have a pretty straightforward answer for how that will change Arctic sea ice. There's a graph here that has a whole bunch of bars. Those bars represent different regions in the Arctic that are all laid out in this map right here. But I want you to focus on that green bar on the far left first. And the numbers beside it are telling you how many days ice-free will we gain, or how many ice-free days will we gain for every degree of global warming for the Arctic on average, just kind of overall. And I like that green bar because it turns out that green bar is just about 30 days per degree Celsius. And the convenient thing about that is that that's about a month. So what we can say is overall, on average, every degree of warming we have gives us 1 more month ice-free. That's on average. It turns out Hudson Bay is really close to the average, and so is Baffin Bay. Those 2 bars, here and there, are pretty close to being a month. But there's some other places in the Arctic Ocean that change faster, up to about like 45 days per degree Celsius. And then there's some places like the Gulf of St. Lawrence, way down here, that didn't have a lot of sea ice to begin with, and they don't change nearly as much. But overall, if you just say 1 month per degree Celsius, that's a pretty good number to take home with you and impress your friends. The other thing I really want to emphasize is that we could also ask, well, how much warming would we need before that ice-free period exceeds a certain number of days? How much warming would we need before the ice-free period becomes 90 days, 3 months, or 180 days, half a year, or 270 days? It's about 9 months. There's a lot of data on this slide, so I just want you to focus on the one on the far left, 90 days right now. I want you to look at the center of the Arctic Ocean, and that's telling us, okay, how much warming would we need for the center of the Arctic Ocean to be open for 3 months? If we could have it open for 3 months, you could have some real good shipping going through that thing. All right. How much warming would we need? All right, let's look at the color. It's that reddish-orange color. Turns out that's right here. So if we look at the color bar, that tells me it's 3 to 3.5 degrees of warming. We would need 3 to 3.5 degrees of warming to make this middle of the Arctic Ocean open for about 90 days a year. That's nice to know. That's actionable, right? So you could bring this to a politician, and, well, they'd ignore you eventually. You could bring it to a politician's aide, there we go, and tell them, all right, if your targets for the world's emissions are going to get us to 3 degrees Celsius, we might get to 3 months open in the central Arctic Ocean. But also do note, if we look at the far right, and you say, how much warming would we need to make it so the middle of the Arctic Ocean was ice-free for 9 months out of the year? Guess what? You need more than 5.5 degrees of warming. We're never going to get there this century. So that's optimistic. There'll still be some sea ice, right? In winter, there will still be sea ice. Another way of looking at this that I think, honestly, I like this way a little bit better. Maybe I should have shown it first. Oh, well. All right, let's just look at Western Hudson Bay again. The area around Churchill. This is a little diagram that shows us the ice-free period at 1 degree of warming. That's in the past, by the way. We're beyond that. So this is around 2000, 2005. Harper prime minister still? Anyway, okay. So 1 degree of warming. That's what it looked like. Notice where that sea ice retreat is happening, early July. At 2 degrees of warming, it's happening in late June now. We've gone from 139 days ice-free to 163. At 3 degrees of warming, retreat's happening in mid-June. We're at 189 days ice-free. If we manage to get to 4 degrees Celsius, it'd be about 220 days ice-free. And retreat would be happening late May, early June. An advance wouldn't happen until after the new year, typically. You could have some weird years, but that'd be the typical thing. So that's how much change you could expect in Hudson Bay. There would still be sea ice in Hudson Bay in winter, even with 4 degrees of warming. But I know what at least 5 of you are thinking right now. What about the polar bears? All right, I have to gloss over a lot of polar bear science right here, and I am a sea ice guy, not a polar bear guy, so keep in mind there's a lot of contentious issues when you're talking about polar bears. The best estimates I have from my collaborators who are polar bear experts is that adult male polar bears in poor body condition, they've eaten not enough, can still survive fasting about 183 days. So there's our benchmark. By the way, it's a lower threshold for mothers with cubs. We won't get into that. Adult males, 183 days, even in the worst of times. So 183 days. When does that become the norm in Western Hudson Bay? Well, unfortunately, the models are not perfect, so I can't give you just one number. It's somewhere between 2.2 and 2.6 degrees of global warming. We're at 1.3, we are not there. 2.2 to 2.6 is when it gets to that threshold. So of course now the obvious question is, well, Alex, or Dr. Crawford if you want to be fancy, are we going to get to 2.2? Are we going to get to 2.6? When? When will this happen? Well, the good news is we are not on track for that high emission scenario. We were at one point. If you go back to the 90s, yeah, we were. But we are not on track for that. We're on track for the middle one. We're on track for that, more or less. So the closest we have, at least. And it turns out, if you look closely at that, and I wrote these numbers down for myself, so let me just double check. Yeah, that brings us to somewhere between 2.5 and 3.7 degrees of warming by the end of the century. Okay? If you look closely, that path that we're currently on crosses 2.2 degrees of warming in about 25 to 35 years. It crosses 2.6 in about 40 to 50. That's what the numbers say right now. You can see there's a lot of wiggle room in all of that because the models aren't perfect and humans are unpredictable. But that does mean, A, it's fair to be alarmed. There is absolutely a scenario where Western Hudson Bay can no longer support polar bears before I'm dead. Sure, totally could happen. But the optimistic thing is we actually could reduce the emissions because this is projecting what the emissions will be. It's not telling us something that's hard and fast and true and must happen. So that means that we actually could make a difference. Probably not just by eating less meat. It probably has to be bigger than that. It has to be government scale, national governments, international governments making decisions that are probably going to reduce profit in order to reduce global warming. They're not necessarily easy decisions, and it's not necessarily the decisions that people will want to make. But it does mean that if reducing the environmental impact is important to people, there is a chance to do things like maintain a polar bear population in Western Hudson Bay. It's still in the cards. It's possible. So hopefully that's a little bit more of an optimistic way to end this. But if you want to know more, I'm perfectly happy to talk a little bit more, have some questions. And so the last thing I should do is just give some thanks to some of my collaborators on this. A lot of the work you've seen came from people like Julian Struve, Dave Babb from University of Manitoba. The polar bear people that I mentioned are Steve Ferguson, Jeff York, Ian Sterling, who we actually also lost recently, sadly. Louise Archer is another one of them, and some other sea ice people, Alex Yan, Abby Smith, Clement Soriat, and Erica Rosenblum. So thank you for all of them and for the funding sources from Canada and from Manitoba for all this. Thank you for having me. Yeah, please.
On the slide that you were showing with the bar graphs, at the very right-hand side, there was CAA and CA.
Yes.
What are those?
Yeah, sorry, we ran out of space and couldn't put the entire words there. So CAA means Canadian Arctic Archipelago, which is a mouthful, but that's this yellow area all in here. And that one is actually, you've managed to find the area the models do the worst. One of my colleagues over at Environment Climate Change Canada, Steve Howell, will be very quick to point out how bad the models are there. And there's a reason for it. You see all those little channels and islands? They're very small. And the models, they're these little squares. Everything has to be a square, right? So if you don't have small enough squares, you can't make all of those channels right. And so that there's other things too, but that fact alone means that the models do not do nearly as well in the Canadian Arctic archipelago as everywhere else, which means that if you want to talk about the Northwest Passage, yeah, we're not really good at that. We're working on it. We're trying to do a better job, but that is one area that, yeah, the models are not nearly as good. So the other one, CAO, that one's a little bit easier to understand. It's just Central Arctic Ocean. It's just the middle thing. Yeah, so right here. Yeah, thank you for calling out acronyms. It's something as scientists we all say we shouldn't do, and we all do. Yeah. Yeah, so the question there was, to what degree do emissions impact the sea ice rather than other factors? And that's a great question, because emissions are not the only thing that impacts the climate or impacts sea ice. So when we're saying emissions, we're thinking mostly about carbon dioxide. That is the big one. But there's other things like methane, nitrous oxide that are also greenhouse gases. But then there is other stuff that matters too. So just taking a really, really large-scale view of things, aerosols matter. So aerosols are little particles in the atmosphere. When there's wildfires is usually in Canada when we're most aware that aerosols are a thing, because you go outside and it's harder to walk than it used to be because I don't breathe as well. So those aerosols, most of them actually reflect sunlight pretty well. So if you have more aerosols, you actually can cool things down a bit. The one exception to that, if you're thinking about wildfires and you think about burning things, you can get some black sooty pieces, and those absorb sunlight and contribute to warming. But if you take it all together, aerosols overall do tend to cool things down. And so the really sad thing is that the better we make air pollution, like the more we reduce our air pollution for things like asthma, the fewer particles that reflect sunlight there are, so it actually makes global warming worse. So that matters, aerosols matter. And another thing that is overlooked sometimes is the way we use the land matters. There are different ways of using the land. It can be forest, it can be farms, it can be marshes. There's lots of different things it can be. And depending on what it is, you will have a different climate. On the broadest scale, you could think about having really dark green trees that absorb a lot of sunlight, or you could think about having like really bright white sand that reflects a lot of sunlight. And that could have a difference for how much energy the Earth absorbs, and therefore the climate, and therefore the sea ice. The last thing I'll say, because those are very high-level things, but another thing that we can think about is, are there other things that affect the sea ice that might not affect the rest of the climate the same way? And the answer is yes, it does get more complicated. There are other things that matter, and one of the big ones is how much energy is going into the Arctic from lower latitudes. So who here has heard of like the Gulf Stream? Has anyone heard of that? Yeah, okay. So the Gulf Stream is a thing. It helps keep England warm, so they're very happy about it. Well, maybe not, but it also makes them wet. That's the thing. And so the Gulf Stream brings nice warm water up toward the Arctic. It helps make the Arctic a little bit warmer than it would be otherwise, because it's nice warm water that's coming from Florida. Well, I mean, long journey. It cools down on the way, but it is making it warmer. So if you were to make that like Gulf Stream a little bit stronger, then you'd make a little bit more energy get to the Arctic. You could melt a little more sea ice. That is something that has happened recently. It's one of the reasons why the area around Svalbard has changed a lot faster than, say, Hudson Bay. So, yeah, great question. And I think there was one closer to front. What was there? Yeah.
It was similar to that.
Similar to that, okay.
In the recent time, what would be the big discovery that has improved the models the most?
The big discovery that has improved the models the most. All right, we're going to try not to get too nerdy about this. It's subtropical clouds. That is the answer. And I don't know if it's a discovery so much as a better computers that allowed us to do it. But one of the problems that we had in earlier models was we didn't really know whether if you make more clouds, does that end up changing the climate to make it warmer or colder? Clouds are weird. There's lots of things that they do to radiation from the sun and from the earth. They're really complicated. And in the most recent, like really big review of climate models, we are now confident that the overall signal from clouds, if you increase the cloud cover, right now you are warming things up. That's the overall impact of the increase in cloudiness. And it's because of clouds specifically in the subtropics. When I say subtropics, I mean, so think like Southern California, but then over the ocean. That is the area, and it's a really nerdy thing, but it does make a big difference. Yeah. Yeah, precipitation's fun. So when we're thinking about precipitation and clouds, the trick is not every cloud makes precipitation. It's one necessary step, but it's not the final step. And so there's precipitation, not one of those things that there's a lot you have to worry about. But the number one overall thing that I think's useful to know about precipitation and global warming is that the warmer you make the atmosphere, the more water vapor it can hold. So that means if the atmosphere can have more water in it, well, that means it can evaporate more quickly, more rigorously. So if you're having a dry period, it can be worse than it used to be because the atmosphere can suck up more water more quickly now. But it also means there's more water in the atmosphere. So that means that if it ever comes out, your maximum amount that could come out is bigger than it used to be. What do I mean by that? I mean, not every storm is going to be like rainier or snowier than it used to be, but your worst storm will be worse than it used to be. And so if you're thinking about the extreme events that cause a lot of damage or even loss of life, well, the worst case scenario is now worse. The average scenario is not that much different, but the worst case scenario is worse. So it's this really, really annoying thing with global warming that it makes it so that bad droughts are more likely, but so are floods. Those feel like they should be opposites. But really what climate change does is it just makes the water cycle more extreme. And so it's extreme on both ends. And shucks. That's all I got to say about that, I think. Yeah. Yeah.
With more and more people getting their roofs covered with solar panels, and according to the economists anyhow, there's going to be many, 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 many more covered over the next 30 years. Is that absorbing energy in a way that would, in a sense, cool the world?
That's a good question. I think that theoretically, if you took the Earth's surface and you made everything solar panels instead of what it currently is, yeah, that would definitely have an impact on the temperature. I'm actually not sure what the impact would end up being because those solar panels do warm up as well when they're absorbing that energy, and what you're replacing might have just had the energy bounce off it. So I don't know what direction it actually would go. It might depend on the material for your solar panels. That's an intriguing question. But one thing that I do know for sure is that the more solar panels you have on your roofs, well, you're changing your energy system now. And that can be in a very good way because it means that you don't have fossil fuels being as necessary. But we all know that solar panels, well, they don't collect energy during the night. So they do present their own complications. So solar panels, I'm all for them. I really want them on my house. I'm a permanent resident now, so I can get the rebate. So I'm excited. Yeah. But it's definitely an area that I think, yeah, the more solar panels you have, the more you can start to think about their impacts. We do know that just cities in general have an impact on the climate. It's mostly localized if you just think about how much warming there might be, and in general, cities are warmer than other places. One of the reasons why they're warmer, though, is because of the excess heat that we lose, the waste heat from all the energy that we produce. So talking about any particular impact that humans might have, there's always an unintended consequence of any technological solution we have. And so it's totally fair to be asking those questions. I think it's great. Yeah. Yeah.
Forests being dark, and you said they absorb heat. What about the fact that forests are furnaces, they absorb carbon dioxide, and they also clean the environment?
Yes, of course, it's more complicated. No, I was not talking about that part at all. I was just talking about, well, just think about the reflection. The other thing I didn't talk about is I used probably not the best example because I did trees and then I did sand. And another thing that trees do is they use a lot of water, and then that water actually evaporates out of the leaves. And that evaporation consumes energy too. So forests help cool things down that way. Sand doesn't do that. It doesn't perform photosynthesis. Well, at least all the sand I've ever met. But then, yes, so another thing with forests that's interesting that can have an impact is, so that process of photosynthesis, if you've ever seen this described in a class before, I wish I had all the diagrams for it, but one of the things it's doing is it's taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and it's making plant material out of that. That includes like the fruits that we like to eat, it includes the roots, it includes the bark, it includes all of that. And the roots in particular are underground. And even after the tree dies, a lot of that material in the roots will stay underground. Even if you've decayed the leaves and the branches, the roots will stay underground. So it is a way you can take some carbon out of the atmosphere. It is not the best long-term way because all it takes is a person with a hoe to go out there and dig up all of that carbon and expose it to decay, and it's back in the atmosphere. So it's not a very long-term solution. Well, I shouldn't say, it's not a very secure solution because it's very easy to put it back. A much more secure solution would be to make limestone out of it and bury it real deep. But unfortunately, that takes a lot of energy. So, yeah.
So obviously there are lots of variables that you're talking about. One of the things that I was reading about was Arctic amplification or something. That's another variable in there that makes things complicated.
Yes, that is a great term that I almost included in this talk. Let me quickly see if I have a slide for you. So this is a map that's showing us how much warming there has been throughout the world between two periods. Let me remind myself of when they were. Right. Okay. So this is basically the last 30 years, 1991 to 2020. That's the current of what like the weather services would call our current normal. And then that's being compared to 1950 to 1980, which is like an old normal. So then how much warming has there been? And the darker the red, the more warming. So there's a few places we can look at. Like if you look at the Western Pacific Ocean, that color there means that it's been somewhere between 0.2 and 0.6 degrees of warming over that period. It's not that much. And then there's the Arctic Ocean, which has been 2.0 to 5.0 degrees of warming. And so when we say Arctic amplification, what we mean is that the Arctic is warming 3 to 4 times faster than the world as a whole. And there's a few reasons for that, but since we were talking about sea ice, just the one thing that I'll say is part of it's the loss of sea ice. So sea ice is pretty white, and when you have snow on top of it, it tends to be really white, and it reflects a lot of sunlight. So you take away that snow and ice, and you replace it with water, well now you can absorb more sunlight than you used to. And what's that gonna do? It's gonna make it warmer. So that means that you have kind of this like positive feedback going on, where you have warming, that makes you have less sea ice, but less sea ice means you have more warming, which means you can have less sea ice, which means you can have more warming, I think I had one person laugh, so I think we get the message now. All right. Yeah. Those are great questions. No, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you all for your wonderful questions. Thank you to our guests for sharing so much about their work and their passion for the Arctic. A few just housekeeping things as we wrap up for the evening. I hope you had time to enjoy the exhibition before the talks, but if you didn't, feel free, of course, to stick around and enjoy them, ask questions, talk to Martha, talk to Jonathan and Alex, or myself and Sue. Friendly reminder that, as Sue mentioned, the Gallery and CMU Press, we are both nonprofit organizations. So sales of prints, sales of books do help support the Gallery and CMU Press. As well, donations are welcome on our website or throughout the evening. And please bring a friend back to experience the exhibition. It's on until August 31st. We're open Monday to Friday, 8:30 to 4:30, and Saturday, 12 to 5. Our next exhibition opens September 13th, and you can ask me to add you to our newsletter if you don't already get it, so you can find out more about upcoming exhibitions. Please sign the guest book on your way out, and thank you for sharing the evening with us. Have a great night.